Hello, everyone. My name is Shannon Allen, and I'm a doctoral psychology student at North Central University. Today's social psychology lecture will focus on how we interpret and make sense of the world around us. This lecture will cover an overview of social cognition and elements such as self-concept, person perception, social categorization, social structures, persuasion, social knowledge, attitudes, attribution of motives, social influence, and decision making. Then I'm going to discuss heuristics and a couple of related concepts like the accuracy-effort trade-off and the less is more effect. And lastly, I'm going to go over some common errors in thinking, such as the fundamental attribution error, availability, representativeness, and unrealistic optimism. So, what is social cognition? Social cognition explains the psychological processes that allow individuals to make sense of the world around them. Processes such as attention, perception, action planning, and memory play a major role in our social interactions, informing how we feel, think, and interact with our social environment. Social cognitions also help us identify, interpret, and react to the emotions and thoughts of others. As previously mentioned, within the field of psychology, the study of social cognition traditionally involves the areas of self-concept, person perception, social categorization, social structures, persuasion, social knowledge, attitudes, attribution of motives, social influence, and decision making. I'm going to go over these concepts in greater detail later in the presentation. The examination of these particular areas has led to a better understanding of group behaviors, prejudice, discrimination, bullying, stereotyping, and peer pressure. Let's start with self-concept. In short, self-concept is a knowledge structure of what you believe about yourself. It is an awareness of internal states and external behaviors, and it's a dynamic method that we use to collect information about ourselves. Self-concept can be impacted by social situations and motivations. Self-concept can include our physical features, our social roles, and our personality. For example, I'm 5'7" with green eyes. I'm a wife, a student, an animal lover, and I tend to be introverted. Self-concept may also include self-esteem. Self-esteem is how we value ourselves and can involve personal comparisons and how people respond to us in social interactions. Self-concept can become malleable depending on social situations. For example, we may have a particular well-rounded self-concept in one social situation, but an underdeveloped self-concept in situations that we are not regularly exposed to. Motivation is another reason why we seek knowledge about ourselves. More specifically, we seek to discover our true selves and determine whether our true selves are socially favorable. The ideal self is another factor related to self-concept. The ideal self is who we want to be, and it can be congruent in that our self-image and ideal self share similarities, or it can be incongruent, where there are discrepancies between the ideal self and self-image. Higher congruence can be achieved through self-actualization, which is an acknowledgement of your potential. Incongruence can lead to cognitive dissonance, which occurs when there is a contradiction between an individual's beliefs and thoughts. Because this contradiction often creates psychological distress, individuals may change their attitude so they better reflect their thoughts, beliefs, and sometimes their behaviors. Person perception concerns what knowledge we extract from others, how we interpret that knowledge, and how our interpretations impact our behaviors. For example, person perception offers accounts of what we remember about, say, the cashier at a gas station that we frequent, or our impression of a stranger in the mall, or even how we feel about a person in our social group. Person perception is the area of social cognition that involves biases and cognitive errors, some of which will be discussed later in the presentation. Person perception also involves the process of social categorization. Social categorization is an innate mental process whereby we classify individuals into social groups based on like characteristics. For example, we may group people based on gender or sex, race, occupation, age, or disability. This cognitive process is one of the ways that help us understand our social environment, as we tend to have general knowledge about members of a social group. However, being a member of a social group does not necessarily mean that all members have direct connections to other members. For example, all females do not interact with each other. The lack of direct connections are what make social categories different from social structures, which I will discuss in the next slide. Social categories influence person perception in that it provides a structure by which to process stereotypical, consistent knowledge. So when we enter a social situation, we have general knowledge about group members that we may interact with. Social categories also influence our self-concept. Social identity theory describes our tendency to identify with in-groups and derogate out-groups. While social categorization is an organic process, it can also have some negative outcomes. Research indicates that we tend to treat people according to their group membership rather than their unique individual characteristics. So, social categorization may misrepresent our perceptions. For example, we tend to overemphasize differences between people from different social groups, while emphasizing the similarities between individuals in the same social groups. This can lead to generalizations, harmful stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Okay, so recall that social categories are not necessarily relationships, but rather shared characteristics. However, social structures are defined as the relationship between individual members of a group. For example, we may ask, is the group an organization? Is it a group of friends? Are there hierarchical components? But more importantly, the social cognitive approach to social structures examines how individuals perceive their own social network and their membership in the group. Given the nature of perception, what we perceive may be different from what others in the group perceive. It may also be different from reality. A social structure may consist of direct relations. A direct relation involves a sender and a receiver. For example, friends Kara, the sender, may go to Beth, the receiver, for advice. Although this is a direct relation, it does not mean that Beth also goes to Kara for advice. However, if Beth and Kara were sisters, the relation would be symmetric, but not necessarily direct if there is no exchange of advice. Now let's go over some terminology related to social structures. First, a broker is a member who connects other members who would otherwise be unconnected. Centrality measures the influence an individual has by the number of connections they have with well-connected individuals. Closure and balance can best be described by this example. Let's say Beth is friends with Kara and Liz. Closure and balance occurs when Kara and Liz are also friends. Degree is the number of connections we have with others. In degree refers to the number of direct connections towards an individual. Out degree refers to the number of direct connections from the individual to other individuals. For example, let's say Beth goes to Kara and Liz for advice. Kara goes to Beth for advice. Beth's in degree equals 1 and her out degree equals 2. Geodesic distance is the shortest connection between two individuals. You can think of this as degrees of separation. For example, Beth is friends with Kara who is friends with Liz, who is friends with Jeff. The geodesic distance between Beth and Kara is 1. The distance between Beth and Jeff is 3. Homophilia refers to the degree of similarities between an individual and those who are directly connected to them. Reciprocity and mutuality determines if there is a direct relationship between person B and A, if there is a directed relationship between person A and B. Similar to the previously mentioned example, if Beth goes to Kara for advice and Kara goes to Beth for advice, then the relationship is reciprocal and mutual. So most of you probably know what persuasion is, but let's look at it in terms of social cognition. In short, persuasion is a stimulus response process by which our attitudes and behaviors are changed due to the influence of others. It's important to note, however, that persuasion is not the same as, say, coercion or threats. We can look at persuasion as negative or positive. For example, persuasion may be seen as manipulative, or it can be seen as mutually accommodating because it offers a platform to consider alternatives. There are 4 primary factors that influence how people are persuaded to change their attitude: the communicator, the message, the communication style, and the receiver. Social scientists have found that the most credible and persuasive communicators have high levels of attractiveness, expertise, and fluency. Messages can be communicated in several formats: reason versus emotion, one-sided versus two-sided, and primacy versus recency. Pairing reason with a positive emotion is generally effective because it helps the communicator earn the audience's trust. Reversely, if you're trying to persuade the audience not to do something, pairing logic with fear can in some situations be helpful. Two-sided arguments are generally more persuasive because they indicate that the communicator is aware of opposing sides. As far as primacy versus recency, there's a continuing debate whether the first information to be presented is more persuasive than the most recent information to be presented. The medium by which the message is conveyed is important as well. Research indicates that people are more persuaded with written content. However, if you need to present verbally, the most persuasive messages are memorable, understandable, and convincing. Finally, it helps to know the values, behaviors, and norms of your audience. Social knowledge is collective information that we maintain about social interactions. This information is referred to as social schemas. Social schemas help us make sense of information by organizing and storing general knowledge representations about situations, groups, or individuals. Social schemas are generally informed by past experiences that help us predict future events by influencing our expectations about how society operates. The formation of social schemas is a function of the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex helps us remember important features and behaviors of other individuals. It also helps us design complex social behaviors and interrelate our behaviors with those of other individuals. Attitude refers to a learned proclivity to evaluate events, objects, people, and issues a certain way. Attitudes have several components. First, the affective component involves how events, objects, people, and issues make us feel. The behavioral component informs how we behave towards events, objects, people, and issues. And the cognitive component is how you think or what you believe about events, objects, people, and issues. Attitudes are generally enduring, but can also be mixed or uncertain, and they can also change. Attitudes can be implicit or explicit. Implicit attitudes are unconscious but still impact how we feel, behave, and think. Explicit attitudes are those that we are aware of. There are several factors that influence how our attitudes form. Attitudes can form from direct experience with or observations of the world around us. Social norms such as roles and expectations also influence attitude formation. We can also learn attitudes through classical and operant conditioning. And lastly, our attitudes can be learned by modeling the attitudes of those around us. Attitudes can be changed several ways. First, and as previously mentioned, operant and classical conditioning and observational learning can change attitudes. Persuasion can also invoke attitude change. And lastly, cognitive dissonance can change attitudes. Attribution of motives involve inferences made about the aims and goals of individuals' intentional actions or communications. For example, we tend to look for correlations between motives and behavior or motives and communications. We may ask questions like, why did they do that? Or what were they thinking when they said that? When we make these inferences, we are better able to gain some understanding about situations that we might encounter, and that helps us make sense of the world. A couple of theories exist that attempt to explain how we attribute motives. Simulation theory proposes that we construct inferences by mentally putting ourselves in the other person's position and attempting to simulate what they are thinking. Implicit theory argues that we invoke social knowledge to infer another person's motivations. Social influence theory holds that a person's beliefs and attitudes and related behaviors are impacted by others through the social cognitive processes of compliance, identification, and internalization. Compliance happens when an individual adopts new behaviors to avoid disapproval and gain approval. Identification occurs when a person espouses a new behavior in order to generate or continue a socially beneficial relationship with a group or an individual. Internalization occurs when an individual accepts the behavior that gains them approval based on feedback from others, and then also adopts those behaviors as part of their personal values. Compliance, identification, and internalization are determined by three situation-related factors. First, the importance of the acceptance into the relationship. Second, the social power or significance of the person or group by which the individual wants to gain or maintain a relationship with. And third, how strong the response is from the person or group. Decision-making is a process by which individuals evaluate alternative choice and choose the one most likely to achieve a goal. Similar to decision-making is judgment. However, judgment relies on information from different sources to form an evaluation. There are several noteworthy theories that attempt to explain what factors influence our decisions. Subjective expected utility theory holds simply that we make choices that best align with our values. Decision theory suggests that we make decisions based on what is socially normative. However, while social psychologists agree that utility and decision theory are relevant to rational behaviors, they argue that these theories are perhaps too simplistic. Behavioral decision theory introduced the idea of bounded rationality. Bounded rationality argues that we have limited abilities in picking the best objective option, so we select an option that perhaps isn't the best, but is rather good enough. So, because of these limited cognitive abilities, we tend to take shortcuts that typically yield sufficient, although, again, not necessarily the best decisions. These shortcuts are called heuristics. Heuristics are simple and strategical mental processes that we use to quickly make decisions, form judgments, or find answers to complex issues. When we employ heuristics, we tend to focus on what we perceive to be the most salient issues. Heuristics should not be confused with probability and logic. While probability and logic share the evaluation of risk and uncertainty, the cognitive method of calculation is different. Risk, with regards to probability and logic, refers to instances where all possible outcomes are taken into consideration. In contrast, uncertainty is the calculation of probability, and logic refers to instances where it is acknowledged that some information is unknown. In situations where risk is involved, heuristics encounter an accuracy effort trade off, where cognitive shortcuts result in decreased accuracy. In situations where uncertainty is involved, heuristics encounter a less is more effect, where disregarding some information leads to more accurate judgments. While heuristics can help us make quick decisions with little mental effort, they're not perfect and may result in flawed judgment and cognitive errors. There are many errors in thinking related to heuristics. However, today I'm going to only go over the four most common: the fundamental attribution error, availability, representativeness, and unrealistic optimism. For each of these four errors, I'm going to attempt to explain how these errors protect self-esteem. I'm going to offer some recent examples, how these may vary across cultures, and some prevention strategies. The fundamental attribution error occurs when we attribute the behaviors of others to internal factors, such as disposition, character, or personality, while failing to consider situational factors such as the social context or cultural norms. For example, in China, it is often considered disrespectful to look someone in the eye. However, in the United States, if we encounter someone that does not look us in the eye, we may consider them rude or suspicious. Interestingly, however, East Asians are less likely to commit the fundamental attribution error than Westerners because East Asians tend to have a holistic view of social context that also involves disposition. In other words, they believe that dispositions are malleable within the scope of broader social influences. In some cases, the fundamental attribution error is a way to protect our self-esteem because while we may attribute the behaviors of others to internal factors, we tend to attribute our behaviors to external factors. By doing so, we can avoid blame and responsibility. For example, I've been keeping up with local COVID-19 updates via Facebook pages dedicated to my small community. So far, we've only seen 4 reported cases. However, a trend that I've noticed is a lack of empathy among community members, with many saying things such as, if I get it due to the victim's carelessness, I'm going to be furious. So, first, they assumed that COVID sufferers were careless instead of perhaps considering that maybe they were healthcare workers or other first responders. Second, they attributed their hypothetical contraction of the disease on the carelessness of others rather than perhaps their own carelessness. One way to avoid the fundamental attribution error is by becoming more emotionally intelligent. By practicing empathy, self-awareness, and self-regulation, you may become more objective when drawing conclusions. The availability heuristic holds that we tend to make judgments or decisions based on the ease by which instances can be remembered. When we rely on the availability heuristic, we estimate probability and frequency, which help us simplify what might otherwise be a complicated decision. Self-esteem and self-doubt are intrinsically connected. The availability heuristic helps us protect our self-esteem by lowering self-doubt. If we feel that we can predict the probability of an event, then we become more confident in our decisions. However, this rule of thumb can go awry when events are more available than others, not due to frequency or probability, but because they're easier to remember due to other factors such as recency and emotionality. For example, we may tend to overestimate the number of shark attacks during, say, the Discovery Channel's Shark Week. If you indulge in too much Shark Week or perhaps hear about shark attacks on the news, and then go on vacation to the beach, you may develop an irrational fear of sharks when in fact shark attacks are extremely rare. Culturally, one study indicated that risk perception in developed countries like the United States, England, and France was largely dependent on media coverage. In underdeveloped rural areas, risk perception was a product of social networking. Therefore, availability errors were most common in these areas due to the lack of official information. For example, in Kenya and Malawi, the probability of contracting AIDS was evaluated by means of hearing about an illness or death within their social network. While Kenyans and Malawians were aware of the basic risk factors, they had no means of acquiring knowledge about prevalence and prevention, so they relied on the observed behaviors and levels of concerns of individuals in their social network. Some easy ways to avoid availability bias is to just stop and consider alternative explanations and also consider what influences your reasoning. The representativeness heuristic holds that we categorize objects, people, or events based on how similar they are to other objects, people, and events that we know. If I say that I'm a vegan, what comes to mind? Do you think perhaps that I'm an animal activist? Well, I'm not a vegan, but I do rescue animals. Similar to the availability heuristic, representativeness heuristic allows us to estimate the probability of an event by comparing it to an already known prototype of the most typical example. However, when we rely on the representativeness heuristic, we may overestimate probability because although an event is representative, it does not necessarily mean that it's more probable. Like the availability heuristic, representativeness protects our self-esteem by helping us make more confident decisions while decreasing self-doubt. So let's tread in some dangerous waters for a moment, not shark-infested waters, but perhaps a little more dangerous: politics. The two-party system has become so divisive and polarizing that in recent years it's even led to violence. One study indicated that the representativeness heuristic created high rates of party bias and stereotyping, especially when the media illustrated the relationships between social groups and political parties. For example, the average American believes that 30% of those who identify as Republican earn over $250,000 per year. However, the actual number is around 4%. One study that compared cultural differences in the likelihood of committing representative bias found that East Asians were more likely to assess the probability of events through an unbiased analytical examination, while Canadians were more likely to employ the representativeness heuristic. Like the availability heuristic, one key way to avoid representativeness bias is to objectively assess whether the event or person is actually typical, and then consider other possibilities. So, just to parse out the differences between the availability heuristic and the representativeness heuristic, the availability heuristic relies on the most salient memory of a specific experience, while the representativeness heuristic relies on the memory of, say, a stereotype or prototype. Unrealistic optimism is an error in thinking that causes people to underestimate the probability of an experience being a negative event. Optimism bias can occur for both negative events, like believing that you're less likely to be in a car accident, and positive events, such as believing yourself to be more academically successful than others. The valence effect indicates that bias is stronger for negative events and can lead to increased risk-taking behaviors. However, positive events lead to feelings of self-esteem. One study indicated that unrealistic optimism was actually beneficial to mental health. researchers found high levels of persistence, motivation, happiness, performance, and success. Since this seems to be at the forefront of many people's attention, I'm going to use another COVID example. In late March, a survey was conducted indicating that only half of Americans believed COVID to be a real threat. This is the dark side of unrealistic optimism, as according to CDC experts, precautions such as social distancing can help stop the spread. However, as I observed across the country, think of Daytona Beach during spring break, and in my own community, many people were not following these guidelines. From a multicultural perspective, one study found that optimism bias transcended ethnicity, age, gender, and nationality. However, another study that compared Canadians and Japanese found Canadians to be more likely to have unrealistic optimism. Another study indicated that unrealistic optimism was lower in collectivist cultures compared to individualist cultures. Lastly, unrealistic optimism is more common among men than women. Professor of Counseling Dr. Suzanne Deggs White offered some excellent advice on avoiding the pitfalls of unrealistic optimism, and I quote, "Maintain an optimistic disposition. Don't discount the risks of actions, and maintain a realistic perspective on what your capabilities actually are." Okay, so let's do a quick overview. Social cognition involves different processes that we use to make sense of our social environment. There's so much information and stimuli that we encounter that it's impossible for our brains to reconcile and consider every detail. So we use heuristics or mental shortcuts to make decisions and judgments. While heuristics are an important and mostly beneficial part of our cognitive processes, overuse or being overly reliant on these rules of thumb can lead to cognitive errors. So it is important to find a balance between too few shortcuts and too many shortcuts.